Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar in a two-part series on species at risk snake habitat on farms. My name is Monique Arts, and today we're going to be talking about how to identify and avoid impacting snake habitat on your farm. Farms provide a lot of great habitat for snakes, and at the same time, snakes are really beneficial to farms and their ecosystem. So both webinars are designed to help farmers have a positive impact on snake habitat. We'll go over the new best available practices for helping snakes on your property. These practices are outlined in the provincial document called Best Management Practices for Identifying, Managing, and Creating Habitat for Species at Risk Snakes. And this document was developed in 2018 by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So these webinars are not meant to replace this document, but instead we hope to make it more digestible to those without biological backgrounds. We also hope this presentation will help you to navigate to the correct section of this document if you do end up needing it. But most importantly, we hope to inspire you to protect, create, or restore snake habitat on your property. The first webinar will focus on how to identify species at risk snake habitat and how to avoid minimizing your impact. And while the second webinar will touch on the other half of the best management practices, and it will be on Thursday at noon. And this webinar today is presented by Blazing Star Environmental. The webinar is provided through the Species at Risk Farm Incentive Program, which is a cost share program delivered by the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. And the StarFIP program provides cost share opportunities for Ontario producers to implement these best management practices on their farms to protect all species at risk. And the program is funded by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. So Blazing Star Environmental was hired as species experts to develop and present the material today. So a bit about Blazing Star Environmental before we get into the webinar. We are an ecological consulting company founded in January 2015, and we work across Ontario to deliver conservation projects for a variety of clients, from government to not-for-profits to land trusts to private landowners, and we specialize in land conservation, species, and ecosystem management. We also conduct some scientific research and monitoring, and if you know anything about us, you know that the majority of our work relates to reptile and amphibian conservation, which is why we're so excited to present this webinar today. Blazing Star Environmental is also the lead author of the best management practices that we're going to be going over in the next hour. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Monique Arts, and with me today is our species at risk technician, Caitlin Hall, who will be helping me give a portion of the webinar today. And here she is.
Thanks, Mo. Hello, everyone. So I am going to be presenting a bit of the webinar today. So now let's jump right in. So first, I'll begin by explaining why we should care about snakes. So a common misconception about snakes in Ontario is that they are dangerous and should be feared, when in fact they present little to no danger when left alone. Snakes only become defensive when they feel threatened, and of all 15 snake species that we have here in Ontario, only one of them is venomous, and that is the Massasauga rattlesnake, which is pictured on the left. So Massasaugas are small and notoriously shy. They would much rather retreat into the safety of dense vegetation than bite a human. And snakes are also of no danger to livestock, as their defensive bite is harmless. Cattle within the range of the Massasauga rattlesnake are at a low risk of being bitten. even if an adult cow is bitten, its chances of dying are extremely low because the amount of venom per unit of the body is small. And as you may already know, snakes are extremely beneficial to people, especially farmers. Snakes contribute to healthy, functioning ecosystems that provide everyone with clean air, water, and soil as both predator and prey within the food web. However, here are a few more benefits of snakes to farmers. So rodents can be very detrimental to crops by damaging plants, spoiling grain with feces and urine, etc. And this can be very difficult to manage. So instead of using costly management solutions like poison and traps, it's simpler to encourage a cost-free natural predator like snakes to manage rodent populations. So a fun fact, the milk snake was named as such because people believed that this snake was taking milk from cows, when in fact milk snakes cannot actually drink milk and are only attracted to barns by the abundance of mice. So in addition to mice, some snakes will also eat slugs, caterpillars, and other crop-eating pests. So in addition to controlling pests, snakes also aid in disease control. So rodents are carriers of many diseases that are transferable to both humans and livestock. White-footed mice, for instance, are carriers of the Lyme bacterium and are a popular host of ticks, making them a major contributor to the spread of Lyme disease. And snakes are excellent predators and are extremely beneficial for controlling disease spread by rodent populations. So another benefit to having snakes around is that they also contribute to seed dispersal. So a Cornell University study looked at seed ingestion and germination in preserved rattlesnakes and found that snakes can be important players in seed dispersal as secondary dispensers. So this is how it works. Rodents will store their seeds in the pouches of their cheeks. And when a rattlesnake preys upon this rodent, the seeds are then consumed by the snake. The seeds are kept intact throughout the snake's digestive system because, as we know, snakes swallow their food whole. And since they are strict carnivores, they aren't able to digest the cellulose and other components of the seeds. And the study found that some of the seeds even germinated within the snake's colons. So snakes do play a very important role in food webs. They control populations of rodents, invertebrates, and amphibians that they eat. And they also provide an important food source to predators such as hawks, owls, and foxes. In addition, snake feces and uneaten parts of their prey's carcasses also act as soil fertilizers. As a result, snakes are essential for maintaining the flow of energy throughout the food web. Unfortunately, however, snakes in Ontario face a variety of threats that include those you see here on the screen. The first of these threats is habitat loss and fragmentation. So this is the one threat that all species at risk snakes have in common. Transforming the natural environment to human land uses such as urban development and agricultural development, including cash crop fields, has been detrimental to snake populations here in Ontario. The constant development pressure will only continue to limit the range of species at risk snakes. Another threat to our snakes here in Ontario is persecution and collection. So uninformed people often kill snakes because of their large size, fear, and misconceptions about them. For instance, the harmless gray rat snake, which is our largest snake here in Canada, growing to 2.5 meters in length, is killed because of its large size. And snakes are also collected for the illegal pet trade. So another threat to our snakes here is invasive species. Phragmites, for example, eliminate shallow water habitat when they form dense strands, and they also spread easily between sites on vehicles and footwear. Disease is another threat to our snakes. Snake fungal disease, for instance, which has impacted several species here in Ontario, including queen snakes and eastern fox snakes. And finally, road effects. So road mortality, of course, snakes are difficult to see on the road, and drivers will sometimes intentionally hit snakes. Habitat fragmentation is also caused by roads. So when snakes will travel 2 to 3 kilometers for different habitat uses, and with so many roads that they have to cross, unfortunately, many of them do not survive. And noise and light pollution is also caused by roads, which is known to affect snakes as well. So habitat loss and fragmentation is arguably the largest threat facing snakes here in Ontario, particularly those in the southern part of the province. So as farmers and private landowners, you have the unique opportunity to help species at risk snakes in your own backyards. So this map here shows the habitat that has been lost in Ontario. The yellow color represents agriculture, the dark gray urbanization, green represents forest, and the blues represent water and wetlands. So as you can see, there is very little natural habitat left here in southwestern Ontario, and that which remains is very small and heavily fragmented. These small remaining habitat patches are not large enough to support healthy wildlife populations. And this is especially problematic for Ontario's reptile and amphibians, as many species are restricted to southwestern Ontario. So now that we have identified why we should help snakes, let's talk about the different species at risk snakes that you might find on your farm and the critical habitats that they require in order to survive. But first, let's define what a species at risk is. A species at risk, or SAR, is a wildlife species that is in danger of disappearing from the wild. And there are 4 classifications for species at risk here in Ontario. So the first level is special concern. So this is a native species that may become endangered or threatened due to a combination of biological characteristics and identified threats, meaning that this species is sensitive to human activities and or natural events. So an example of a species of special concern here in Ontario is the monarch butterfly. So the second level is threatened, and this is a native species that may become endangered if proper action is not taken, such as the barn swallow. The third level is endangered, so this is a native species that may become extirpated or extinct if proper action is not taken, such as the little brown bat. And the fourth level is extirpated. So this is a species such as the eastern box turtle that no longer exists in the wild in Ontario, but can be found elsewhere. So the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario evaluates the status of our wildlife species here. And it's important to note that the species shown on the slide here are represented based on their provincial listing, and that their federal status may be different. So for example, the monarch butterfly is listed as a species of special concern here in Ontario. However, in Canada, it is listed as an endangered species. So there are 15 species of snakes here in Ontario, as I mentioned before, and one extirpated species, which is the timber rattlesnake. Of these 15 species, 9 species and subspecies are currently listed as species at risk, or SAR. So this section will cover brief species descriptions, statuses, and distributions. And you can look at the range maps displayed on the following slides to determine which species are found in your area. And there are arrows indicating key ID features for each snake. And to learn more about these species, I encourage you to visit the Ontario Nature Reptile and Amphibian Atlas website, which is listed on the bottom of your screen. So first up, we have the eastern ribbon snake. This snake looks very similar to the eastern garter snake and the Butler's garter snake, which we'll get to later. And it can be differentiated from them by a white crescent in front of its eye. Now, these snakes live in wetland environments. And I should note also the map in the top left corner, what it's showing. So the green squares represent observations before and after 1999. The yellow squares represent observations only after 1999. And the red squares represent observations only before 1999. So the eastern hognose snake is named for its upturned snout. It's unmistakable and the only snake species in Ontario to have a nose like this. The coloration and patterning of this species is highly variable. And they also have a unique defensive display that includes flattening their necks like a cobra, hissing, and striking with a closed mouth. And as a last resort, they will play dead by turning onto their back and remaining motionless. This species is widely distributed here in Ontario, but it's rarely seen. So if you do see one, be sure to report it. So next we have the eastern fox snake. This is our third largest snake here in Ontario, and it can grow to 1.7 meters in length. It has a distinct orange colored head and dark blotches all over its body and a checker patterned belly. Next, we have the Massasauga. So this is our only rattlesnake here in Ontario. It's a pygmy or small rattlesnake and only reaches about 60 to 75 centimeters in length. It is brown to gray in color with butterfly or saddle-shaped blotches down its back. It is easily identified by its rattle. However, the rattles can break off. The Massasauga is a habitat generalist and can be found in meadows, shoreline habitats, wetlands, forests, rock barrens, old fields, and grasslands. And we have 2 populations of them here in Ontario. The Carolinian population is currently listed as endangered, and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence population is currently listed as threatened. And as you can see on the map, their range is limited to mostly eastern Georgian Bay. So the queen snake is found near streams, basking on rocks, or in shrubs and trees near the water. It has 3 dark stripes down its back and a distinctive yellow stripe along the lower side of its body. Now the Butler's garter snake looks very similar to the common eastern garter snake. The only way to tell the difference is the location of the stripe on its side. On Butler's garter snakes, these lateral stripes are centered on the 3rd scale row. The gray rat snake, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest snake in Ontario and can grow to 2.5 meters in length. They live in forests and wooded areas, but spend part of their summer in old fields and meadows. They are excellent climbers and are found mainly in trees. The Lake Erie water snake is a subspecies of the common water snake. However, this species is only found on Pelee Island and other western Lake Erie islands. Now, the blue racer is named for its bluish gray body color and speed. They can travel up to 7 kilometers an hour. Today, it is only found on Pelee Island, but historically, it was also found on the mainland. And finally, we have the eastern milk snake. So this is not a species at risk here in Ontario. However, it is listed federally as a species of special concern. And as you can see from the map, it is widespread throughout southern Ontario. So determining which species are present on your property can be difficult, as snakes are very cryptic, and even if you haven't seen any of these snake species on your property, that doesn't mean that they aren't there. So a great place to start is by checking the range maps that we just went over on the species slides to narrow down possible species that might be on your property. In addition, the Ontario Nature Reptile and Amphibian Atlas is a great resource that includes up-to-date interactive maps of species records across the province. So the website is freely available to anyone with internet access, and it looks like this and can be found at the link below. So using the drop-down menu, you can select each of the snake species in Ontario, in addition to our other reptile amphibians, and determine if there are any records of them in your area. So again, green squares indicate records before and after 1999. Yellow are records only after 1999, and red squares indicate records only before 1999. So it's also important to note that even an absence of species records in your area does not mean an absence of that species. However, if there is a recent record of a species at risk on your property, so a green or even yellow square, and suitable habitat is available, then it is likely that that species is present. So as Monique mentioned earlier, in 2018, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry produced a document entitled Best Management Practices for Identifying, Managing, and Creating Habitat for Ontario Species at Risk Snakes. So the next couple of slides will review the purpose, limitations, and layout of this document. And most of the content for the rest of the webinar comes from this BMP guide. There are reference pages to the document at the bottom of the slide, so you can refer to them for more information if needed. The BMP document is currently not available online. However, if you would like a copy of it, you can email info@blazingstar.ca and we can send one to you. So the purpose of this document is to assist with the protection and recovery of Ontario's species at risk snakes. It also provides guidance on snake habitat identification, habitat impact avoidance and mitigation, and habitat creation and restoration. It provides necessary information for individuals undertaking activities within or adjacent to species at risk snake habitat so that they can apply with the Endangered Species Act. This document is based on the best available information. However, there is still a lack of information on the effectiveness of the recommended approaches when applied, which is essential to improve our understanding of snake habitat creation and management techniques. So this BMP document will be updated to reflect new information as our understanding changes. And you're encouraged to submit any new information to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks at the email address listed on the slide. So this webinar will cover the first 4 sections of the BMP document, and there will be another webinar, part 2 in this 2-part series, on sections 5 and 6, which will be about habitat creation, restoration, and maintenance, and how to effectively monitor habitat management activities. So webinar 2 will focus on teaching you how to create all of the habitat types that will be discussed in this webinar today. And as Monique mentioned earlier, it will be presented this Thursday, March 19th at 12 p.m. So make sure to tune in. So in order to protect our species at risk snakes, we must protect their habitat. So to do that, we need to know what species at risk habitat is and what types of habitat snakes use. So the Endangered Species Act defines habitat as area on which the species depends directly or indirectly to carry on its life processes, including life processes such as reproduction, rearing, hibernation, migration, or feeding. So snake habitats can be divided into 5 categories based on what snakes use them for. So we'll go through each of these critical habitat types individually and discuss important features of each of them. So in Ontario, snakes hibernate and spend their winter underground in hibernacula or hibernaculum singular. The hibernation period begins in September, October, or early November and lasts until April or early May, depending on the species, seasonal weather variation, and latitude. Hibernation habitat is limited on the landscape and is crucial to the survival of these species. Most snakes, such as the eastern fox snake, hibernate communally. A single hibernacula can contain dozens or even hundreds of snakes. And many hibernacula house several different species of snakes. So snakes will overwinter in a variety of habitat features, including rock crevices, animal burrows, foundations, crayfish burrows, root cavities, ant mounds, wells, cisterns, etc. So in the photo on the left, there is an eastern fox snake basking next to a crated hibernacula. Very difficult to see, but he is there. However, not all underground cavities are suitable for overwintering. There are some important microhabitat characteristics that hibernacula must have in order for snakes to survive the winter. So this diagram here depicts the hypothetical life zone model. So the life zone is the area where snakes can hibernate successfully. So it's the area between the frost line and the water table that provides sufficient oxygen. Now, it's important that snakes hibernate below the frost line so they don't freeze, and above the water table so that they don't get flooded out or drown. Now, the size of the life zone can vary depending on the topography, soil type, drainage, vegetation cover, and other environmental factors. It also changes regularly over the winter, and precipitation and snow melt occur, so it has to withstand this fluctuation. So snakes in Ontario are either ovoviviparous, meaning that eggs hatch inside the female and they give birth to live young, or they're oviparous, meaning that they lay eggs. So egg-laying snakes, such as the blue racer and the eastern hognose snake, whose eggs are pictured on the screen here, typically select nesting sites in open habitats that receive full sun for most of the day in order to incubate their eggs between 24 and 36 degrees Celsius. Higher nest temperatures result in shorter incubation periods for snakes, which increases hatchling survivorship because it allows them to have more time to forage before their first hibernation. So snakes will typically nest between mid-June and late July, and hatching typically occurs from August until mid-October. And again, this can vary based on latitude and weather conditions. So nesting sites can include rotting stumps, hollow trees, cavities under piles of rocks or vegetation, mammal burrows, compost piles, and brush piles. Now, live-bearing snakes like the Butler's garter snake and the Massasauga use specialized habitat known as gestation sites. So gravid or pregnant females will choose their gestation sites that are open with minimal canopy cover that allow them to regulate their body temperature and incubate their eggs that they are carrying. It's important that these gestation sites also provide gravid females with shelter from predation. So these sites can include rock and log piles, mammal burrows, brush piles, low-lying vegetation, beaver lodges, boards, and scrap metal. Gravid females will move to their gestation sites shortly after emerging from hibernation, and they will remain there until they give birth in late summer. So unlike mammals, snakes are ectothermic, meaning that they cannot regulate their own body temperature and rely on the sun to keep them warm. Therefore, snakes alter their behavior and habitat use in order to maintain an optimal temperature between 25 and 34 degrees Celsius. So to thermoregulate, snakes prefer open and edge habitats with enough complexity to offer them shelter from high temperatures and predators. So snakes will increase their body temperature by basking in sunny areas and reduce their temperature or avoid predation by retreating into dense vegetation, under rocks, or underground. So naturally occurring basking sites include rock barrens, forest clearings, fields, brush piles, rock piles, meadows, forest edges, and shorelines. And for semi-aquatic species, also wetlands. So these are just a few examples. So snakes will also use man-made features such as wood piles, barns, hedgerows, and retaining walls. Sorry. Snakes will bask mainly in the springtime when the air temperature is cooler, and in the summer they bask less as ambient temperature is at or near their optimal body temperature. And depending on their food preferences, snakes will forage in a variety of habitats. However, they will typically look for food in open and edge habitats where they can also thermoregulate. Butler's garter snakes, for example, will forage and thermoregulate in old fields and meadows. Queen snakes will use river shorelines, and blue racers use savanna habitats. Depending on the species, snakes' home range sizes can be several kilometers. Snakes will travel to find food, mates, and suitable habitat. Seasonal movement patterns include spring and fall migration between hibernacula and summer habitat, and movements by males during the mating period, and of course movements by females during gestation and nesting period. So snakes will move through a variety of habitats that they would otherwise not use, such as closed canopy forests, open water, sand dunes, hedgerows, drainage ditches, etc. However, snakes will avoid very open habitats with no cover that put them at risk of predation. So as we know, snakes shed multiple times per year, and this process can take several days to complete. During this time, snakes are vulnerable to predation because they have restricted mobility and their eyesight is also impaired. So many people may not know this, but this is caused by the scale on their eye also shedding as well. Now, during the shedding period, snakes use habitats that will allow them to thermoregulate under cover while providing protection from predators. So this is often cooler than their optimal body temperature, but it offers them greater protection. Now, basking sites are very similar to the type of habitat used for shedding and provide similar conditions. So habitats where snakes like to bask, such as barns, brush piles, and rock piles, also provide suitable shedding habitat. So now that you know the types of habitats that snakes use, let's discuss how to determine which ones might be present on your farm. So visually searching for snakes is one way to determine if species are using important habitats on your property. Now, it's important that these surveys are carried out at the right times of year. So for example, to determine if species at risk are overwintering on your property, searching in and around hibernacula like rock crevices, foundations, and animal burrows in the early spring may reveal the presence of snakes. However, the general cryptic and subterranean nature of some of these habitats makes them tricky to identify, even for reptile experts. Also, the short window in which snakes spend time at these habitats adds to the difficulty in identifying them. If you want to conduct your own visual survey to determine if there are species at risk if there is species at risk snake habitat on your property, you would do so by walking through the habitat and visually searching for species of interest. So this is known as a visual encounter survey, or VES. Using certain tools such as binoculars to scan habitat features before approaching them so you don't spook any snakes, or using snake hooks and sticks to poke around in areas where you cannot see, and this is especially important in Massasauga habitat, are useful tools when conducting these types of surveys. So again, looking under cover, flipping rocks, logs, wooden boards is a great way to find snakes. And if you are in rattlesnake territory, use caution and do not put your hands where you cannot see them. And remember that methodology, timing, and search effort are all important factors to consider when conducting a visual encounter survey. And for more information on surveying for snakes, you can see section 3.3 in the BMP document. So another way to identify if snakes are using habitat on your property is to find evidence of their presence. So this includes shed skin, eggs or egg fragments, roadkill individuals, etc. Shed skin and egg fragments are most likely to be found at their respective shedding and nesting habitats, so brush piles, compost piles, rock piles, and rotten logs. Field surveys conducted by reptile experts may be necessary to determine the presence of species at risk snakes on your property. So now Mo will talk to you about how to avoid harm to snake habitat.
Thanks, Kate. Okay. So now that we all know how to identify snake habitat within the agricultural landscape, I'm going to go over how you can take some simple steps to avoid negatively impacting this habitat. So habitat can be damaged or destroyed to the point where it can no longer effectively support snakes' life processes. And this can be incredibly harmful for snakes and can cause them to have to locate new habitat. And if new habitat cannot be found in time, it could lead to mortality. Fortunately, these negative effects can usually be avoided through proper planning, especially if a reptile expert is involved. And some activities that alter species at risk snake habitat will need to be authorized under the Endangered Species Act. So in this section, I'm going to provide recommendations that will help you to minimize or eliminate your potential effect on species at risk snake habitat. So as Kate mentioned earlier, habitat loss and fragmentation are the greatest threats to Ontario's snakes. Therefore, it's really important to avoid destroying or damaging the habitat that we have left. So some habitat is actually legally protected under the Endangered Species Act. This act was created to identify species at risk in Ontario so that these species could be protected and recovered. As you see on the screen, Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act prohibits the damage or destruction of habitat of a threatened or endangered species. So, however, not all activities that alter habitat are actually damaging to snakes. So, as stated in the BMP document, habitat is only considered to be damaged if it impairs or eliminates the function of the habitat for supporting the species' life processes. So, for example, alterations that may actually be positive, for example, throwing rock piles from a field next to a hibernacula will actually enhance that hibernacula by providing basking and shedding habitat. However, many activities are damaging and do require proper planning. So not all habitat is equal. Some habitat is very sensitive to alterations, while other types of habitat are more resilient to disturbance. Under the Endangered Species Act, habitats have been categorized based on the snake's anticipated level of tolerance to alteration of that habitat. So as you can see on the screen, the three categories are illustrated here, and category 1 includes highly sensitive habitats that have the lowest tolerance to change, and this includes hibernation sites, gestation sites, and nesting sites. These habitats are listed as category 1 because they require very specific microhabitat features, and these features are often rare on the landscape. In addition, snakes are highly dependent on these more rare habitat types. Hibernacula in particular are the most sensitive habitat type because snakes tend to go back to the same hibernation site year after year. So if one hibernaculum is destroyed, individuals may perish in the winter temperatures if they're not able to find a new habitat. And furthermore, snake species that hibernate communally in groups of hundreds of individuals are at risk of local extirpations if their hibernaculum is destroyed. So moving on to category 2, category 2 habitat is less sensitive and more tolerant to change, and it includes basking sites and foraging sites. So these are the areas that snakes spend most of the active season in. And these habitats are listed as category 2 because they are more abundant across the landscape and they're easier to create than habitats in category 1. Now category 3 includes habitat that has the highest tolerance to change. These habitats include movement corridors. So snakes are able to move through a variety of habitat types and therefore can adapt more easily if the habitat is damaged or destroyed. Therefore, many activities that would alter or damage movement corridors are unlikely to impair the function of the movement corridor to the snake. This diagram illustrates how eastern fox snake habitat is legally protected under these 3 categories. So as you can see in this case, only a small portion of the overall habitat is identified as category 1. So you'll see the red circle around the center of this image that illustrates category 1 habitat, and that is an area where a fox snake had laid its eggs. Now category 2, and it includes 30 meters surrounding that egg laying site. Category 2 habitat includes all the orange areas within, so these are the areas that are suitable for foraging, and it's all suitable foraging habitat within 1,500 meters of that Category 1 habitat. So as you can see, there's some linear orange features, which are hedgerows, and as well as a few woodlot features are also highlighted here that are within 1,500 meters of that red Category 1 habitat. And then all other natural areas located within 1,500 meters is classified as Category 3 and is used for snake movement. So as you can see, most of the area is Category 3 and therefore has a high tolerance to alteration. So therefore, if you do have species at risk habitat on your property, typically only a small area is sensitive to alteration and should be avoided when conducting projects on your property. So this is really important to understand when you're planning the location of any project that will change the landscape of your property. And these buffers, the areas of each category of habitat differ for each species at risk snake based on their biology, and they can all be found online. So that being said, it's important to implement certain practices and plan projects to avoid harm to the most sensitive species at risk habitat. So project planning is everything. So although these recommendations should be considered on a case-by-case basis, they are generally effective methods for avoiding harm to species at risk snake habitat. So the very best way to avoid negatively impacting snakes is to relocate the project to an area that you know snakes are not using. For instance, carrying out your project in a section of retired cash crop field or an old parking lot is unlikely to affect species at risk snakes because snakes don't typically use this open kind of monoculture habitat. In addition, it's also important to consider indirect effects of actions as well. For example, building a structure next to a snake basking site would impede the functionality of the habitat by shading it. So even if the structure is outside of the footprint of the habitat, it still impacts whether the habitat can function as basking habitat if it's being shaded. It's also important to consider the sensitivity of the habitat that you'd like to work in, and we just went over this, so remember the 3 categories and carry out any projects in the areas that are least sensitive to alteration when possible. If your activity only has short-term impacts, projects should be conducted during a time of year when the habitat is not being used. For example, if you're carrying out some kind of activity that impacts the water table near a hibernaculum, do that during the summer when you know snakes aren't underground hibernating. But note, if you do adjust the water table near a hibernaculum, it should be returned to the level it was before the project, before snakes are going to head back into that hibernaculum for winter. This chart displays the times of year when it is and isn't okay to carry out short-term activities. So it's best to carry out activities in important habitats during time of year when the snakes are not using these habitats. So you can see the habitats are listed along the first column, and the time of year when snakes are using the habitat is listed in the middle column during the active period. So you want to avoid impacting these habitats during the active period. If your project has short-term impacts and only short-term impacts, the non-active period is the time when you want to be doing any kind of projects that will impact the habitat of species at risk snakes. Okay, so now I'm going to go through each type of habitat, snake habitat, and provide some recommendations for how you can avoid impacting this type of habitat. So I'm only going to be giving a summary because we don't have all the time in the world. So I'm just going to give a summary of for each of the habitat types, and for more information, the BMP document has much more detail. So if you are going to be implementing a project that may potentially impact snake habitat. I encourage you to look at that best management practice document to determine how you can limit your impact. So hibernacula are very sensitive to a variety of changes, and this is because they have specific attributes below ground and above ground that need to be there for snakes to hibernate successfully. So even impacts that occur a fair distance from the overwintering site or hibernaculum, like changes to water table, can have damaging effects. So the recommendations you can see on the screen will help to avoid adverse effects to hibernation habitat. So first, you want to avoid activities that will affect the underground structure of the hibernacula, and these activities may include blasting and excavation, the use of heavy machinery that could compact the earth and collapse the underground chambers. In addition, you want to avoid activities that will affect the surface structure and the habitat composition of the area, such as clearing shrubs from the area, because these shrubs are really important to provide cover for snakes when they're emerging from the hibernacula or going into the hibernacula. It's important to avoid activities that would affect the water table, as I mentioned earlier. These types of activities might include ditching and installing tile beds, and long-term activities such as clear cutting. So you want to avoid making changes that would make the hibernation habitat more prone to human disturbance. So avoid creating public hiking trails and ATV trails too close to the hibernacula. And in addition, avoid constructing roads altogether near this habitat type to avoid mortality of snakes. Okay, so moving on to gestation and nesting habitat. These types of habitat are particularly sensitive to disturbance. With proper project planning, though, it is possible to avoid some of these adverse effects. So you want to avoid activities that would reduce sun exposure in these areas. So avoid planting too many shrubs and trees or building a shrub structure next to this kind of habitat, because sunlight is very important to incubate the snake's eggs. You want to maintain or restore any naturally occurring cover objects, such as logs and rock piles. These are important features used for basking and hiding. And avoid mowing and herbicide application that will remove this important ground vegetation or low-lying shrubs. So snakes require this cover to escape from predators when gestating. So at nesting sites, it's important to avoid disrupting nesting material until after the nesting period is finished. So wait until at least late September. And once again, avoid creating trails, ATV trails, hiking trails, or roads near this type of habitat. It's also important to avoid creating barriers, including solid fencing or retaining walls that would prevent snakes from accessing these habitat types. So moving on now to basking and foraging habitat. This is the type of habitat snakes spend most of their time in, and this habitat has moderate tolerance to changes. So since sun exposure is important in these basking habitats, it's important to avoid increasing canopy cover by planting lots of trees and shrubs once again. Once again, it's important to maintain or restore naturally occurring cover, including logs and rock piles. Excuse me. Avoid removing any ground vegetation or low-lying shrubs by mowing or applying herbicides. Avoid constructing large structures in these areas that would shade them out. Small-scale construction projects may not affect these habitats, but once again, it will depend on the project specifics. And once again, you want to avoid creating any barriers that is going to prevent snakes from accessing this important habitat. Now, if these fence or wall features are necessary, you are able to modify them to allow snake movement. For example, you can create openings at the bottom for snake passageways, or you can even build the fence 30 centimeters off the ground if that works for the type of feature you're building. Okay, so the last type of habitat is movement habitat. So any activity really that impairs the movement of snakes will adversely affect movement habitat, while most other activities in this type of habitat will have no major effect on snakes. So large-scale changes in land cover within movement habitat can be acceptable if they don't impede or prevent the movement of snakes through them. So once again, avoid creating solid barriers across movement habitat. In addition, avoid creating large open areas that are unsafe for snake movement, such as parking lots and large tilled fields. This is because snakes are really vulnerable to predators in open areas. So snakes actually won't even go into these areas because they feel too vulnerable. Where possible, avoid removing hedgerows, because hedgerows are really important movement habitat for snakes in the rural landscape. And once again, it's important to maintain or restore naturally occurring cover objects that snakes will use as they're moving through an area, and avoid removing ground vegetation or low-lying shrubs, because the snakes will also use this structure to hide as they're moving through areas, moving between their different habitats that they need throughout the year. And once again, avoid constructing major roads in this type of habitat, such as highways and concessions. Smaller roads like access roads and roads with driveways on farms are less likely to impact this type of habitat, but large highways and concessions will. So that was just a brief overview of how to avoid harm to species at risk snake habitat. As I mentioned earlier, please consult the best management practice document that we've been talking about if you would like more details. Okay, so we've now reached the end of the webinar. I'm just going to go over some key takeaways as we wrap up. So, snakes are beneficial on farms, and Ontario species at risk snakes and their habitat are protected by law. So before you implement any project, it's really important to determine if species at risk snakes are present on your property. However, even if they are, there's many activities that can occur within and near habitat. And if done following the recommendations from the BMP, there can be no impact to snakes. So proper project planning is really important to prevent or limit adverse impacts to their habitat. So snakes need our help, and hopefully this best management practices document will help you to help the snakes on your properties. So as we mentioned earlier, the best management practices document is not currently online, but if you would like a copy, you can email info@blazingstar.ca and we can email you a digital version of it. So upcoming, Blazing Star Environmental will be holding an in-person training workshop to teach the best management practices that we went over today, and that will be covered in the upcoming webinar on Thursday about how to restore and create and monitor snake habitat. So this will involve actually going outdoors, actually identifying snake habitat and creating some type of snake habitat, as well as monitoring snake habitats. So if you're at all interested in this type of a workshop, you can email training@blazingstar.ca, and the email address is on this slide. So, and we will provide more updates on the course. Currently, we don't know when we're able to hold it, but as soon as we know details, we can let you know if you let us know that you're interested by emailing training@blazingstar.ca. So part 2 in this webinar series, we'll go over how to create, restore, and monitor snake habitat on the farm. And both webinars will be available on the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association's website in case you miss one of the webinars or part of the webinar, or if you want to watch one more time to review. And if you have any questions, you can email info@blazingstar.ca, and we'd happily answer any questions on the topics today. And once again, thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope you learned something new, and we hope you're inspired to protect snakes on your property. And we hope you tune in to the next webinar to learn about how to create and restore and monitor species at risk snake habitat on the farm. Thank you.